Project. We're a non-partisan think tank examining some of the big strategic issues facing our country. Today we're about listening in public diplomacy, about the 2014 Arab Youth Survey. Our speaker today is Leveton. He currently is the Worldwide Executive Vice President of Burson-Marsteller and the CEO of Penn, Sean and Bowen. He has had more than a decade of market research experience working for BSB, where he's developed expertise in both quantitative and qualitative research methodology. He's led domestic and international research projects over 30 countries, conducted research in major national Democratic Party clients, and performed market research for a variety of Fortune 500 companies. And I'm just going to turn it over to Jay, who's going to go through the Arab Youth Survey and some of the conclusions, and then we'll do a moderated Q&A afterwards.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you to ASB for inviting me and for giving some airtime to the Arab Youth Survey. As I'll walk you through the headlines, but I just want you to know that obviously this is the 6th time that we've done the survey, and to give you some of the details. So we were there before the Arab Spring and had a good understanding of what was going on among the youth of the Arab world, and knowing that this was an audience and a group and a demographic in the world that was something to keep your eye on, something to listen to, somebody people to listen to. And so what you're seeing here today is the 6th iteration of the survey, and you're seeing 30,500 face-to-face interviews among Arab youth 18 to 24. So in particular, this is an audience for those who kind of are market research junkies. This is a group that in the Arab world and the Middle East that we are still doing face-to-face research. Obviously, if you did this research in the United States, Western Europe, the internet is a great place to reach 18 to 24-year-olds, but here in the Arab world, we are still doing face-to-face interviews with a sample split between 50-50 male and female. And this is our largest survey to date. In 16 countries, we handle the GCC region, which is Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And then followed by the Levant region. You can see those countries in North Africa, and then Yemen as well. So I think this is a very broad sense of the geography of the region. And what we do is then also just take a very broad landscape view of general attitudes of Arab youth today, current events, economy, education, values, foreign relations, and their overall media consumption habits. And so I think what we'll do today is really I just want to highlight the top 10 findings. It's for you to peruse. There is a website at arabyouthsurvey.com that you can get more information. If you're interested in learning more, happy to answer more of the questions and follow up as necessary. We'll walk you through the methodology in a little bit more detail, and then walk you through the top 10 findings, and then, as Paul said, take some of your questions at the end. So we just have an hour here. So as I said, if you look here, we started the survey back in 2018. It was 10 countries, starting with the UAE all the way through Lebanon here. So a heavy focus on these countries, and as you can see where in these countries it was taken primarily in the major metropolitan areas as well. And so I think here are the main 10 countries. And then in 2011 we added Iraq, in 2012 Tunisia, Libya, in 2013 Algeria, Morocco, and Yemen, and then for the first time we have added Palestine to get an understanding of what's going on here. So again, very strong view of the Arab world in the part. And then also just to give it a little bit of a setup, and I think we'll dive in. This was a very interesting and challenging time in the region for when the survey was done. I think the last Arab Youth Survey was done in 2013. We presented it in January. And then the Arab Youth Survey this year was done and fielded in January 2014 over the December-January time period. And as you can see here, this was a very tumultuous time in the region. As you can see here, there was a new government in Lebanon in March. There was major protests in Turkey. While some people wouldn't say Turkey's in the Middle East, there were very large protests in Gezi Park in Turkey. There was an election in Iran. There was not news to many of you. There were major protests and demonstrations in Egypt and overthrowing of the government in Egypt. And then there was, given the armed hostilities in Syria, there was large amounts of refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, and other places coming over the border from Syria, and all of that that goes with it. And then there was a large amount of ongoing fighting in Iraq in there as well. So it was a very tumultuous time, and I think what you're seeing here is that For the most part, what we'll show you is the top 10 findings that after the Arab youth uprising, the Arab Spring, I think there was some high levels of optimism in terms of feelings that things were heading in the right direction. And I think while we still see that, they're still falling back now. That people in the area and around civil unrest and some of these challenges that are taking places in countries like Egypt, Syria are beginning to cause some questions in the mind of Arab youth, whether you live in the UAE, whether you live in Cairo, whether you're in Abu Dhabi. I think there's overall anxiety among this group. And while I also say we do a lot of survey research among millennials or 18 to 24-year-olds around the world, this still remains a very optimistic group. They feel that their future is very much ahead of them. I think they feel very strongly that there's some good economic opportunities for them, and probably much more so than they would even say here in the US or Western Europe, where they're much more downbeat about their economic opportunities. And actually, you also see that this group actually gives very high ratings to government and their ability to address the issues there. So in terms of the top 10 findings, we'll walk you through a growing number of youth embrace modern values while family, friends, and religion continue to shape their lives. Interestingly, we asked this question, which of the following is closest to your view? Traditional values mean a lot to me and ought to be preserved, or traditional values are outdated and belong in the past. I think this is one of the most enlightening questions here, and I think we left it just to the respondent to understand what is traditional values, what are modern values. We didn't want to bias them and tell them what that meant. But overall, what you're seeing here is some significant changing here. The Arab Spring has brought around this idea that the buzzword of modern values are starting to become more important, and even at the expense of traditional values. And I don't want to say traditional values are important. Traditional values are very important in many parts of the world, but this idea of modern values is picking up steam in particular. And then as you look at here, thought, well, are there any differences among any audiences, among any of the countries here? And you see very little, even among the GCC countries like UAE or Saudi. Traditional values were at around 55, 57%, but a good amount of people were saying 45, 43% were saying traditional values are outdated and people are keen to embrace modern values. And then really, as you said, no difference across the board. Even if you go to North Africa, Tunisia, or Libya, all of them are pretty close to the same. So I think this is overall a region-wide movement, region-wide thinking, whether you're in a place like UAE or you're in North Africa, etc. I think the other thing that's worth highlighting here, and maybe this plays a little bit into the whole thing here, is that while parents and family and religion are still the most important, those numbers have been coming down in the last couple of years. Religion has dropped from people saying parents were at 73%, they've moved down to 67%. Family has moved from 66 to 58, and religion has moved from 69 to 56. And friends are still rather flat, but overall there. So I don't want to overestimate it because I think we want to see what the trend is as time goes by. But in particular, what you are seeing is some of the, quote, traditional sources of information, the traditional sources of influence remain important, but overall you do see those numbers starting to decline. As I said, that's something to keep your eye on as we continue to do the survey. And not surprisingly, what is picking up here is you're starting to see community leaders are starting to become more important. And for the first time, social media bloggers, we asked this question for the first time, and it came in number 5 here. For the very first time we asked it, came in very strongly. And then in particular, you'll see some of the numbers get smaller. TV celebrities came in last, but again, that was the first time we had asked that. So for the most part, parents, family, religion, and friends remain very influential, but again, those numbers starting to come down from very high and very elevated levels. And social media, not surprisingly, becomes more and more important given the role that social media is playing in terms of the demonstrations in Egypt and other places where social media is heavily used to be able to cause the change that you're looking for in a lot of these markets. Number 2, youngsters confident in their national government's ability to deal with a wide range of issues as well. I think what's interesting here is you look at these, how confident are your national government's ability to deal with the following issues? Overall, you're seeing on average here, mid 60% people high levels of confidence. I can assure you, if you ask these questions in the US, Western Europe, you're not going to get mid 60s on anything. There's high levels of polarization in our country in the US. There's high levels of polarization in Western Europe, in other places. And so, the ability to address everyday issues is really quite important. So I think, in particular, living standards, economic stability, unemployment, everyday issues around the economy are very important to young people. And I think what you're seeing here is you get very good scores As I said, that becomes particularly surprising when you think about what the global economy is doing today, and some of the challenges you read about young people being able to get jobs. We'll talk about a little bit about that. But again, in terms of economy, scores are quite good. And as you look at security in terms of war and you look at terrorism, also you get mid-60 type of scores, again, which is quite good. I think the interesting thing here is climate change, the scores are a little bit lower at 43%, high levels of confidence, and wealth creation is a little bit lower, excuse me, as well. But if you're a government leader in this area and you say, wow, I really need to improve my ratings on climate change, you'll soon see at the end of the presentation that climate change is the least important issue for youth in their world today. If you ask that of people and young people in Latin America, you ask them in the United States, climate change is an important issue to them. You see the Obama administration has taken action around carbon emissions in terms of the EPA plan the last week and a half. So they were addressing that, but I think that surprisingly in the Arab world, climate change is not a major issue. The scores are actually not great. But again, given that's not a huge issue, it's okay for a lot of these leaders in government. So again, just to keep in mind here, the overall, you're dealing here with government scores that are quite good if the governments are trying to address the need of young people in particular, and they see a level of confidence from that. Again, just to reemphasize what I said at the start, in terms of how far do you agree or disagree with the following the uprisings across the Arab world, I feel the Arab world is better off. Right after the Arab Spring, that was 72 agreed with that statement, 24 had disagreed, and then the following year it stayed relatively flat. And you're seeing that across the second question, which we'll talk about as well. But in 2014, you're seeing that number drop precipitously. And I think that's one of the bigger question changes that you'll see in the survey is overall following the uprising. There's an overall concern that the Arab world is not moving in the same direction, at the same speed it had in the past. And I think, as we said, Egypt, Syria are big drivers of that image today. The challenges that they're having. That as a result of the uprising, I feel I'll be better off in 5 years. 71 in 2012, now down to 58. So I think there's a little bit more enthusiasm for themselves in terms of how they'll do, but there's a lot more anxiety, a little bit more anxiety around how well the Arab world will do. And I think there's overall anxiety about the region, some anxiety about how they'll do, but much more so about the region and the ability to move forward, driven a lot by this civil unrest that's taking place. In particular, as we said, and I think not surprisingly, when you look at the issues that are going on, I think when you talk about the wider Arab world, civil unrest becomes more important. But when you look at everyday issues, people are generally concerned about rising costs of living. This is true in other countries around the world. This is very true in India, with high levels of inflation. You're also seeing higher levels of inflation in the Middle East. You're seeing rising cost of living remains important and has grown since 2011. Unemployment has become more important. The national economy remains very high. And interestingly, as you look at this, opportunities for women continues to grow. We actually looked at this by men, and you look at it by women. There's no difference. Men were actually or as likely as women to think that opportunities for women was an important priority, and people were concerned about it. So I think that's an interesting data point as we continue to grapple with places in Saudi Arabia about the role of women in society, driving, for example. And then also the threat of terrorism. I think these really are the top 5 concerns. So if you look at the top 3 concerns, you see a lot of focus on the economy. Not surprisingly, but as I said, there's a lot more confidence here that the governments will be able to address the economic issues. And if you look at these issues, as I said, in Western Europe and the U.S., high levels of focus on the economy as well. And then here, terrorism is there at the bottom. But these really are the top 5, and I think opportunities for women, I think, is something to continue to keep your eye on, and you'll likely see that continue to grow as well. And then as you look at this here, it's interestingly, what we looked at, obviously the GCC markets have a lot more resources, a lot more robust economies versus others in North Africa or in the Levant region. And you see cost of living is a universal region-wide issue, but if you look at unemployment, you're really seeing this as a non-GCC issue. The ability for UAE, Saudi to be able to create jobs for young people has been able to keep their unemployment number concerned quite much lower than the overall region altogether. The Levant region, North Africa, unemployment remains a very challenging issue for people there to be able to get jobs for young people that they want as well. So I think it's interesting to keep in mind the rise in cost of living remains a region-wide issue. Unemployment remains kind of a non-GCC issue in particular. And then here, as you look here, concerned about, would you say, the rising cost of living, again, just to show you here across the board, the numbers all remain relatively the same. Even, as I said, the more robust markets, like in economics, UAE, Saudi, everything remains quite high around cost of living. And as you look at unemployment, Lebanon, Iraq, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, and then the highest number of all, Egypt. Egyptians, people very concerned about jobs and being able to find a job for themselves and provide for their families at some point, or graduating from college, or graduating from university to make that transition from school to work. But again, I think it's interesting. Egypt #1, Algeria #2, Iraq #3, Tunisia #4. So we're getting a heavy dose of North Africa feedback around unemployment. #4, Arab youth believe civil unrest is the biggest obstacle. And as I said here, civil unrest in terms of what do you believe is the biggest obstacle facing the Middle East. We looked at the top 5 issues. Civil unrest was at 41, moved up to 44, and took a major jump here at 55. Lack of democracy has declined somewhat. The threat of terrorism has increased. I think, as you said, these kind of all go hand in hand. And then, obviously, the lack of strong leadership. I think while they say that their own leadership in their own country is quite good, the lack of strong leadership in some of these areas that are experiencing major changes remains an anxiety point for them. And then we asked this for the first time, the rise of Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist movements came out as one of the top 5 issues of what they were facing. So we clearly do have to focus on other countries and have a good handle on what type of Islamic movements are doing and how they're impacting sovereign countries. So the civil unrest, terrorism, Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic movements remain the biggest obstacles. But again, interesting, as I said, what's missing here is in terms of for the region itself, the economy, not here. For their local countries, they're focused on the economy, but in terms of for the region, they're still focused on everyday safety, everyday security. They're still dealing with those bedrock issues as a region as a whole. And then just to show you from the GCC, same, lack of democracy, same. So really no differences here, in particular when you're looking at the different types of markets that make up a diverse region. #5, I thought this was a really good, interesting point, and I think something that's true of millennials and 18 to 24-year-olds around the world. When we ask the question, do you feel people of this generation are more likely to start a business than previous generations? We actually had Sheikh Mohammed tweet this stat in particular, which was great. And you have high levels of belief that people of this generation are more likely to start a business. Some of the highest numbers were in Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Palestine. It's interestingly places where that have the most challenging economies people are the most optimistic about entrepreneurship. It's very interesting because I think when you get a sense that no one's going to create a job for you, you're just going to try to go figure out how to do it yourself, right? So I think that's probably what's going on here. Places where they maybe feel more confident that they can get a job, they're going to get more focused on trying to find the right job for them because there may be a variety of better opportunities. So I think this is an interesting slide that obviously entrepreneurship is important, and I think what you need to keep in mind, again, about a lot of these countries is a lot of these jobs are government jobs that people are looking for to have. So the fact that they want to be able to start a business is really an interesting thing, and I think it's going to require some change of mindset for government policy to make in a lot of these countries about how to be able to give young people the tools, how to create the environment to be able to allow them to start jobs, particularly with the ability to just use the internet to start and do a say and create your own company and do your own thing and be able to ship something around the world, what that you would make or you would do. This is a big challenge for government policymakers to be able to allow them to be able to create and start their own jobs. So I think entrepreneurship, particularly in markets that have the most challenging economies, really are potentially the areas for most opportunity for activities for entrepreneurship in particular. And I thought this was fascinating here. If you asked young people in the U.S. or Western Europe if you want to work in government, those scores are quite low. Most of you are probably potentially getting experience now or working in government at some point in time and probably may want to think about starting your own business or work in the private sector. But here, they're in the GCC, even in 2012, 64% of people prefer to work in government. That number has since declined quite dramatically to 50 to 43. In the non-GCC markets, they're still focused, they're 64 down to 43 now in the GCC. The non-GCC markets, they're still very focused on government. So I think Interestingly, with not surprisingly, when you see the economies that are the strongest, there is a focus here on the decline for government has been quite strong, and to be able to get into the private sector. And the private sector numbers are increasing here on the GCC from 19 up to 31. And again, in the non-GCC markets, they're having you're seeing a little bit of a decline. So, you're seeing some significant desire here to move into the private sector, particularly in GCC, which tends to lead the region a little bit more. And then, the non-GCC markets are following here behind a bit. But again, interestingly enough, that at this rate, government is still the most attractive option for them. But overall, the private sector attractiveness is increasing there. We always ask this question. This always tends to get the most media in the UAE. They like to write this story quite a bit. That the United Arab Emirates is the country the Arab youth most like to live in and see as a model for their country to emulate. We asked which country in the world, if any, would you like to live in? A plurality of almost 40% of people said the UAE, and that number was up 8 points in the last year. Interestingly, Turkey, given everything they had been through, had dropped off this list for the first time. France has declined from 18 to 13. And then actually there was a pickup 5 points for the United States. But overall, there's just this overall sense the United Arab Emirates has struck the right balance here of economy, development, outreach to the rest of the Arab world in particular, and to be a hub of the Islamic economy in particular. The UAE has done quite well and continues to do well, and continues in some ways really to pick up speed. And for the first time also you're seeing Qatar has come development as well. And so has got some very good scores here. And Saudi has remained generally flat, but benefited by France declining. But overall, right now, the United States is second, given everything the U.S. challenging relationships the U.S. has in the region. Overall, the United States still remains very popular and very strong. But again, the UAE remains the big story. And then desired country to emulate. Same thing takes place. France has declined. Turkey has declined. And interestingly, they are saying China is a country that they would like to emulate, still in the top 5, interestingly enough. And then UAE has continued to increase. And then, as I said, the United States actually picked up 9 to 10 points. In particular, if it's a country that they like to emulate. And as I imagine there's a large amount of people who come to the United States for college education. And the ability to experience what the U.S. has to offer remains quite strong. Unfortunately, not great scores for the UK. Didn't show up. Neither did Germany or any of the other ones. But overall, the United States remains strong, and France has begun to decline as that's Turkey in particular. And again, as we said, China. Number 7, Arab youth consider the country's biggest allies to be their regional neighbors. So if you go in particular, we have seen very little change. And interestingly, sometimes when you get into a lot of these issues and there's a lot of upheaval and a lot of turmoil in the region, you would think maybe there's some rethinking of the allies or rethinking who's on whose side. But overall, Saudi Arabia remains kind of the main regional superpower, followed by the UAE. The main biggest allies, even after the Arab Spring, you've seen very little movement. If anything, Qatar has slipped here a little bit, just some of the challenges they've had in the relationships with other GCC markets. Countries they've had some challenges. Kuwait remains very strong. And the United States has picked up a little bit, but it still is seen as number 5. And so I think it's interesting they want to emulate the U.S., but they don't necessarily see it as the biggest ally. They see Saudi and UAE in particular as well. Then I think, again, you could say, well, maybe you see some differences between the markets, North Africa or the Oman region. No, there's generally consistency across the board. We're seeing very little changes of who they see as their natural allies, biggest allies in the region. So Saudi, UAE remain very strong. Qatar, not much differences here, if any at all. Number 8, we said, interestingly, Arab youth are increasingly concerned about obesity and lifestyle diseases. As we said here, we've seen a major increase here for obesity just in the last year. I don't know if you know, but the Middle East has a very challenging health situation in terms of diabetes, and also obesity is becoming much more of a bigger deal as the region continues to develop and grow. Access, and discretionary income continues to grow. There's issues around lifestyle become more important. So as I said, diabetes has become one of the bigger health issues in the Middle East. Obesity is probably also interrelated with the diabetes issue. And then, not surprisingly, cancer, heart disease not something that young people are really thinking about on a day-to-day basis. Obesity, and maybe their parents are dealing with issues around diabetes or obesity, but that's becoming what their main issues are. And then, one of the other bigger changes you're seeing is I'm not concerned about health issues. Well, that also saw a drop. So they're becoming more and more concerned around health and the impact it would have on them in particular. Interestingly, in the last year, do you feel healthcare in the country has improved? I think overall, while it's interesting, again, I think this is another challenge that the government policymakers have to deal with. As these health issues become more important, it's more important that they would be able to, address the healthcare issues and improve the healthcare delivery system in their countries. But overall, there's some improvement here, but I think, there's still generally a majority of people have felt it stayed the same, and so I think, this remains an urgent priority to be able to deal with healthcare and to be able to address some of these lifestyle challenges that they're starting to have. But in the same way that the U.S. is dealing with obesity issues, dealing with diabetes, chronic illness, and those types of things, it's a challenge that they're going to face in the same way that they have to deal with creating private sector jobs and those types of things. Number 9, overwhelming majority of young Arabs believe they're entitled to subsidized energy costs. It's interesting when you look at this. Despite energy being quite inexpensive in the Middle East. Have you been in the Middle East recently? I would say the price of gas in your car for the Middle East is quite low. Yes, I think it's a fraction of what we pay here in the United States. It's certainly a fraction of what they pay in Western Europe. Overall, they're still very much on subsidies. And I think that's an interesting thing. But again, not surprising when you think through that their anxieties around cost of living remain very high. And so even though obviously they don't go around comparing their gas versus our gas versus Western Europe's gas, they do very much looking for subsidies for gasoline. And I think there was some large demonstrations in Jordan or Egypt. There was some large demonstrations around the fact that some of the, I don't know if somebody knows the story, but there was some idea that they were going to take some of the subsidies off, and it created a very large backlash, particularly among young people, that they're going to take the subsidies off. So this tells you that there's still, a large amount of support from the government to be able to subsidize, cost of living. Then as I said here, interestingly, we gave them a whole series of things that we asked them, which the following say is the biggest challenge facing the Middle East today. Again, as we said, rising cost of living, national economy, corruption, government, public life was number 3, the overall pan-Arab economy, Israel and the Palestinian conflict, debt, unemployment. You see a large amount of focus on the economy. But then as you get lower down here, overall shortage of health care, quite low, access to clean water was quite low, freedom of the press was quite low, and then again, the environment was the least important issue for young people, which if you did that in any other market around the world, you would find the environment always remains very high with young people, but in this market, these markets remains of a low importance to them. So I think as you see here, economy again remains very strong, debt, unemployment, obviously Obama just did something on student debt here, which is a big challenge that we have here in the U.S. But again, safety, economy, personal safety, environment, those types of things, which the government is very high for young people as they do in other parts of the world. And then just to finish it off here, just in terms of media here, you're seeing very strong scores here for television remains quite high. I think you've seen very similar types of things, but again, the changes that we've seen here, not surprising, have been in online in terms of where you get your news from 47 to 59. Social media, we asked 2 years ago, has gone from 20 up to 29. And what you are seeing is serious deterioration in newspapers, serious deterioration for radio, serious deterioration for magazine, friends and family also going down in particular. So, but again, this actually looks kind of like what you see in Western economies in particular. So it's interesting that media, as it become global, issues and problems remain generally regional or local in their scope. And so, interestingly enough, media and global news consumption remain in some ways, very global in terms of how their usage are. So I think that's very interesting to know. And then most trusted news source, TV news channels actually has taken a pretty big decline. I think I'm sure you've heard about the challenges that Al Jazeera is having in some markets, has impacted TV news. Social media has more than quadrupled in terms of trust. Newspaper has declined, and then radio show and magazine has never really registered. But overall, you're seeing a decline in news. While people are consuming a lot of news on the TV. Overall trust in TV news has gone down. Yeah.
On the pane before this one, how did you differentiate your questions online and social media?
Yeah, that's a good question. We just asked them, and so we asked them, and then they were allowed to give as many answers as they like. So they could say online, and they could say social media, they could say both. But social media would be, based off of Twitter, all those types of things, their social media feeds and those types of things.
But it would not include websites?
Online would include websites.
But social media would not?
We let them decide, but most likely yes. So that is, I think, so that's in trust, and then news consumption. What you're also seeing here is the amazing spike in just overall daily consumption of news in the overall region has been amazing. 18% of youth said they were checking and updating themselves on news and current affairs every day. That number has tripled in the last year of people in the last 4 years. 4 years, that number has gone from 18 to 47, and that actually, just after the Arab Spring, 18 to 52 is literally in 1 year. This tells you a truly cataclysmic event took place in the region. They were using the news to keep themselves up to date. So that's a very interesting thing that we wanted to point out. And I think that's probably, I think that is actually it. We've got through all 42 slides very quickly, and then open-ended questions that you may have.
That's absolutely fascinating. We'll do Q&A. If you raise your hand up, we've got a microphone coming around and just say where you're from and who you are, and ask the question. But I'd like to ask one first of all. We see people using news all the time in this global market. Why is climate change and the environment so low now, and the concerns, and yet so high in the rest of the world?
Yeah. No, I just think, I think it's a good question. I'm not sure I know the direct answer. I would say I'm just not sure that dialogue is taking place. In the policy debate drives a lot of the news coverage here in Western Europe. Countries like Australia and Germany, they've had robust debates around moving from fossil fuels to moving green energy. Here in the U.S., we're doing the same. Actually, we're a little bit behind how a lot of those markets. But I think that debate of moving from fossil fuels to alternative energies, given the importance of fossil fuels to the region, that debate hasn't really taken place from a policymaker point of view or from anybody in particular in the element of society. The debate just hasn't really taken place.
Questions?
I'm Kurt Solbers with Vanguard Government Strategies. That's a really fascinating set of findings. I have two questions. One is on your finding number 2 about confidence in national governments to address problems. I'm curious if that broke down country by country. I don't think I saw a slide, country by country. So I'm curious if you say Egypt, has a different sense on that than a country that's been more stable.
Sure.
And my other question is, I was just curious on your question about that alliances where Saudi Arabia came into play. Was there any distinction there between, say, kind of security alliance versus economic partners?
Yeah. Let me take your second question first. I don't think you're asking a decently sophisticated question in terms of the difference between economic collaboration or security collaboration. I'm not sure young people think through it at that level. I think they generally get the sense, try an understanding of who do I trust from a point of view in terms of values, being able to represent the Arab world well, who are some of the biggest players, who are the most sophisticated players. I think that's what you're seeing there. And also a lot of it is driven just by the overall size and scope of those countries, as I said. So a lot of the economy drives a lot of it, where are the opportunities in particular for them. So if you live in Beirut and you're looking potentially to move and find a new job, Dubai looks very exciting and interesting to you as a place that you would like to go. On your first question around differences, the truth of the matter is we saw very little differences between confidence in countries. I think Egypt was a little bit lower, but you would think, given the challenge, it would be quite low. But it wasn't quite low, and I think they understand a lot of what's changing is actually the young people themselves are trying to drive that change. So some of that change that they're looking for, they're generating and creating themselves. So I think that in particular kind of skews a little bit. But I think overall there was decent levels of confidence across the board in terms of the government.
and Egyptians would have been responding to the Morsi government in particular to that question.
Well, the Morsi government was out by then.
They were gone.
They were gone. And so I think they felt like there was trying to be there was some address, even though, are they addressing everything they probably want? Probably not. But overall, I think it was probably a little bit better because they basically had thrown out the previous government, and the new government had basically, been brought in at their desires. But no, it's a good question. I don't think young people think through the differences on that. I think overall they're much more driven by economy, opportunity, size, scope, security, not getting into that too much. And I think overall, you would think you would see lower scores on government, but overall they remain generally consistent across the board at high levels.
And why do you think that Syria was not higher up in the list of concerns?
It's a good question. I think if you live in Saudi or the UAE, that's a ways away. Or the issues that they're facing are very different from the issues that are in Syria. I think, so I don't want to say that Syria was important. I think from a regional point of view, I think young people have figured out that these types of conflicts tend to dominate the news headlines of how the region's viewed. And how the region for the region to be able to move forward together or as a whole, they're bonded by one language and by values that in particular. So when countries like Syria and Egypt go through this type of wholesale upheaval, it has an impact on the overall region. They know that it has an impact on the overall region. But for the most part, in a lot of these other countries, they look at this from a very country by country basis. So things that are going on in the UAE or the things going on in Tunisia are very far away. Maybe to the same extent, if you live in California, you're not thinking of what's going on in Oklahoma in particular, maybe almost to that extent. But for the most part, what you're seeing is economic issues, everyday lifestyle issues are very country by country. Particularly your cost of living, which is the true economic problem that exists in the region today is cost of living. As you saw, unemployment was a kind of market by market issue or a non-GCC market. But I think Syria and overall terrorism, those sorts of things, they kind of saw that as something going on over there, and it wasn't something that was overall impacting them on a day-to-day basis. But overall had a large impact on how the region's viewed and overall ability for the region to be seen as moving forward.
And we saw a rise in, for want of a better word, popularity in the United States this last year. Was there any reasons why you thought?
No, nothing in particular. It was interesting. I think overall, the United States remained very popular with young people as a place they would like to go, a place they would like to learn, a place they would like to emulate. But I think a lot of it was actually just due to the decline of some other countries like Turkey and France and other places. France obviously has had its own challenge from an economic point of view. Turkey has its own civil unrest issues, and so I think the United States kind of benefited to the expense of some of those other countries from a statistical point of view.
In your primary finding, in the increasing likelihood that Arab youth would be looking to embrace modern values, because there was no set criteria for modern values, do you think that they were most likely responding to, in terms of traditional values, do you think they were more likely responding to geopolitical values or religious values or economic values? You have like some kind of...
No, you're asking a $64 question. It's a good question. The answer to that question is we didn't probe into that a lot because the truth of the matter, I didn't expect that type of change. But I think what you are seeing here is on the next slide after that, you did see some decline, while important, of the role of family, the role of religion, the role of religion, family, there was one other that we talked about. But overall, those kind of general staples were started so high that over time, as people become more globally connected, it only makes sense that some of those things would decline. I think, it may start looking more and more like the Western part of the world, where family is still important and maybe the number one thing, but there are still a lot of other things that rival it, whether it's TV, whether it's celebrities, whether it's social media, whether those types of things. I think overall you're seeing this natural progression of a region that's becoming more and more globally connected and taking part and getting on a bigger role and a bigger stage. And so that naturally is taking place, the fact that they are some of those traditional sources of where to get information, where to get influence have started to decline. And so I think that's something that you probably want to keep your eye on. But I think what you're seeing is probably this idea of modern values encompasses all of those things. But in particular, those traditional sources of support and influence have just started to decline. And that's probably driving what you're seeing in terms of that question.
You have one more. If there was one conclusion that you found in your study that made like your head scratch that you would want to further study in your 8th Arab survey, youth survey, what would it be?
I think the interesting thing was, let's just go back. The climate change thing, given the debate, you always wonder, climate change really did last.
Right.
Given all the debate, I mean, that's a bit of a head scratcher, particularly among a young audience of young people. That's a head scratcher. And then I would just also say, just going back here. You're always amazed by entrepreneurship in terms of the countries that have the most economically challenged environment, the most entrepreneurship. People always joke that a lot of the entrepreneurship and a lot of the major companies in the U.S. or in Western Europe were created during recessions, just because that's when things, that's when people are focused on trying to create for themselves because maybe they're not getting the opportunities that they want. But overall, I would say just this high-level entrepreneurship. At the same time, people still are focused on government sector, private public sector jobs. That's an interesting tension that's taking place in the economy in those regions. In that region is that the government sector is seen as great, good, high-paying jobs, but at the same time, they want to start their own businesses. So that's changes that's worth keeping an eye on over a long period of time.
Doug Johnston with the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. This may be redundant with the question that you just received, which was, what was the greatest surprise to you? What the most counterintuitive finding of all?
No, I would stick with that, and I'd also just say, I think the other thing would be, I think amazingly, given what's taking place, the fact that there's still a high level of confidence in the government, because you see, in every part, this is a globally connected audience. And the fact that there's still a large amount of challenges around the economy, cost of living, you would think they would be more concerned about their government's ability to address their issues, but for the most part, they remain very strong. I'm sure, President Obama would kill to have a 66% job approval right now, given everything that's going on here and around the world. But 66% high level, they had the highest levels of confidence around their ability to address economic issues, which were their main concerns. That's, it's good to be a government policymaker or a leader in the Middle East if you are truly addressing those issues. It's when you don't address those issues that you put yourself at risk, or if you're not seeing it being able to address those issues, as you've seen in Egypt or Syria and other kinds of places. But I think overall, the fact that they're being seen that, at the same time, other government leaders are being overthrown. There are high levels of government confidence despite some of the economic challenges that are taking place, which usually has a direct correlation, in fact, on overall government satisfaction. In particular, I think that was quite high, and also, as you said, this idea of being entrepreneurial, even though they're asking for government, they like government sector jobs.
The whole region seems to be very homogeneous in that sense. I mean, I know you do a lot of work for private sector clients all over the region. Are we seeing the wider Arab youth coming together?
I think in some instances, yes. I think in terms of values, this idea around modern values, you're seeing very little differences because of this globally connected idea that everyone's starting to embrace the same things. I think some countries are further along than others, but for the most part, they're generally very similar, and I think there's some minor differences between economy, whether everyone is concerned about inflation and cost of living. Some are more concerned around jobs. Some in some countries are more concerned around civil unrest because they're in areas that civil unrest is quite prevalent. But for the people in particular, the values, the ideas, the overall, they're pretty homogeneous. It's not when you start digging a little bit deeper on economics and those types of things that you're actually starting to see a little bit of difference. But it is relatively, the answers you're seeing, even in a chart like this, relatively homogeneous in terms of how they're answering a lot of these questions, which is interesting.
Very much so.
Hi, Tatiana Anderson from Alberta TV. Given the sweeping political change that has happened across the region, did you guys consider asking, and given the fact that a lot of that was driven by youth, social media, that sort of thing, did you consider asking these youth about the importance of the role of activism, whether it was, nonviolent activism, something else? And if you didn't consider that, is that something that you would consider in the future? I'd be very curious to see what their answer would be to something like that.
Actually, we didn't ask it. This is actually only the top 10 findings. I don't actually think we got into it, but we would certainly be open to it in the past. Sure, I'm sure it would be very interesting in terms of, but in particularly non-violent.
Well, I would be curious to know what their thoughts were on both, activism in general, and break it down into nonviolence versus violence,
Sure.
what's most effective.
Yeah. We did not specifically probe on that.
Mirai Ozan, also from Al-Hurra TV. I just have a technical question here. When you conduct these surveys throughout the years, do you find that you have difficulties conducting them? Like, are people reluctant to answer you, or is it in just certain areas and not others?
No, actually, it's quite interesting. What we find is we don't generally have a problem. I think in some instances, the challenges that we face are in the regions that have, in the markets that have the most civil unrest, remain the most challenging to actually conduct the survey. But actually, in what you actually see in a lot of those areas, the people are the most eager to speak and the most eager to give their point of view. Interestingly, this was a 30-minute survey done face-to-face. And it was done mostly in major markets in the area, so we didn't go out to the rural areas or to non-metropolitan areas because obviously just from height, it's more expensive to conduct the interviews and do that work. But what you're actually seeing here is you're asking questions about kind of how do they feel, their opinions around everyday issues. I wasn't trying to sell them like telephone services. I talked about telephone calls for 30 minutes. So the fact that we were asking about them, things that they like, their personal interests, how they view the world today, how they view their country, how they view their government, that's a very interesting thing that in many instances they may not be asked a lot to do. So actually the truth is participation rate was quite high.
So you had no problems with governmental sides in like the GCC countries, for example?
No, actually.
This has been absolutely fascinating. There's some key takeaways, I think, for all of us. We look forward to next year's and see the progress. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.